Good evening. So today in our next books of the Bible in 5 minutes, we're tackling 1 Samuel. There is a ton in 1 Samuel. I'm going to try and get through it all in 5 minutes. I'm not sure we're going to make it, but it is action-packed. And it's really about the transition from the time of the judges to the monarchy, when we have Saul and David and Solomon. And Samuel is the key link in that transition. He anoints Saul, he anoints David. The idea being that the king is subject to the word of God as conveyed through the prophets. And this is all pointing forward, right? So the Bible is one story about God gathering people to God. And here in 1 Samuel, we have the transition to kingship, but if the people can't put their faith in the king because the king is broken. And so we see David, and this is all looking forward to when Christ comes as king in the house of David. So we start with a miraculous birth. There are so many of these sprinkled throughout the Bible, Jesus certainly being the most notable. But Samuel, his mother Hannah, is noted to be barren, but just like Sarah, Abraham and Sarah, Hannah conceives, and she has this song of Hannah. And it's a song of great reversal, right? And it kind of echoes Mary's Magnificat. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. But it goes on to talk about reversal. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. And so again, we get this idea of the weak finding strength, and the strength ending up, and the strong ending up weak. And so Eli, who was the current priest at the time, he had corrupt sons. And so what's going to happen is Samuel, who's Hannah's son, is going to basically take over for Eli. There's this famous story when God calls Samuel, and he calls him in the middle of the night, and Samuel runs to Eli, says, "Here I am," and this happens 3 times before finally Eli figures out it's God calling Samuel. And so Samuel says, "Here I am, Lord." And so next, there's this great story where the Israelites and the Philistines fight. And the Israelites have come to kind of using the Ark of the Covenant as this token and kind of bringing it out when they need something good for good luck. And so they do that, and the Philistines defeat them and capture the Ark, and they take it back and they put it next to their false god, who has the good sense to worship. And so the false god falls over in the middle of the night. The Philistines come and they stand it back up. And then it happens again, except the false god's head falls off. And so there's all these series of calamities until finally the Philistines figure out, this thing is too dangerous. Let's give it back to the Israelites. And so the people are clamoring for a king. Samuel tells them, he warns them about a king, says the king will abuse the power. The king will be costly. But the people say, we want to be like other nations. We want visible signs of success. We want a king just so we can be like other nations. And so they get Saul, who is tall and handsome. He looks like what a king should look like. Although when Saul is presented, he's hiding out of fear, perhaps a sign that Saul is not the man that the Israelites need to lead them. And so, and it begins soon, Saul's downfall. He goes to fight the Philistines. At one point, he gets tired of waiting on the priest, so he makes a sacrifice. He does it himself. He kind of sees the rites as a way to gain God's approval. He doesn't trust God. Saul is self-absorbed. And so Saul leads this military victory, but he doesn't fulfill God's orders. He's supposed to execute God's justice, but instead Saul is trying to enrich himself. And so God rejects Saul, the first king, and God is saying obedience is better than sacrifice. God is after the hearts of the people rather than just their sacrifice and the rites. And so Samuel then goes out to anoint David. We get King David enters the picture. And at the time, so Samuel goes to the house of Jesse and he looks at all his sons. He said, no, it's none of these. And David is out tending the sheep. Again, this is the reversal. The weak are lifted up by God. And then David, probably the most famous scene is David and Goliath. David is outraged that Goliath would insult God. And so David goes out to fight. He defeats Goliath, and Saul becomes envious of David's fame. And so Jonathan, who had the rightful claim to the throne, Jonathan is Saul's oldest son, but he protects David. He sees what God is doing in David, and so Jonathan gives up his right and aligns with what God is doing, even though it costs him. And so he becomes David's friend. There's this beautiful friendship between the two of them. And so Saul just becomes consumed by envy. He tries to kill David. David has several chances to kill Saul, but he restrains himself, trusting in what God is doing. And Saul is eventually killed by the Philistines. He has this terrible downfall. He's filled with envy, and he's killed in battle. And looking forward to David's reign, which is covered in 2 Samuel.